People think the underworld is entirely about blood, bullets, and unbreakable codes of silence. But the cruelest hits don't leave physical scars, they leave shattered pride. Lorenzo Costa, the ruthless head of the Chicago syndicate, thought marrying Clara, a quiet, overweight girl from the South Side, was just a hilarious punchline to a $5 million bet made in a smoke-filled VIP room. He thought he bought a pawn. He thought he owned her humiliation. He was dead wrong. Because what happens when the punchline stops crying, dries her tears and decides to rewrite the joke. This is the true story of a bet that cost a mobster his empire, his sanity, and his heart. The Pendleton Club sat discreetly off the Gold Coast of Chicago, a bastion of old money, rare bourbon, and quiet, violent men. It was a Tuesday night in November, the kind of night where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts through wool and bone. Inside the velvet-lined private poker room, the air was thick with the scent of imported Cuban cigars and the quiet clinking of crystal glasses. At the head of the table sat Lorenzo Costa. At 34, Lorenzo was the undisputed king of the Italian syndicate in the city. He was a man carved from ice and ambition, possessing a lethal combination of corporate intelligence and street brutality. Across from him sat Declan Gallagher, the brash, hot-headed leader of the Irish faction operating out of Canaryville. The two men were technically at peace, bound by a fragile truce brokered over shipping routes, but the room crackled with unspoken hostility. The game was high-stakes Texas Hold'em, but the real currency being traded was ego. Enter Clara Higgins. Clara was 24, exhausted, and wearing a poorly fitted white catering uniform that did nothing to flatter her size 18 frame. She worked for Bella's Banquets, a high-end catering service that frequently and blindly serviced the city's criminal elite. Clara wasn't supposed to be in the VIP room. She was covering a shift for a co-worker who had called in sick, desperate for the overtime pay to cover the mounting bills at Mercy Hospital, where her younger sister, Sophie, was undergoing aggressive leukemia treatments. Clara kept her head down, her dark hair pulled into a tight, frizzy bun as she balanced a heavy silver tray of Scotch glasses. She was painfully aware of her body, acutely conscious of the way the expensive suits in the room didn't even look at her as a woman, but as a piece of the furniture. As she leaned in to replace Declan Gallagher's glass, a sudden, booming laugh from one of Declan's lieutenants startled her. Her elbow clipped the edge of Declan's chair. The tray tipped. A single splash of Macallan 25 spilled over the rim of the glass and landed squarely on the cuff of Declan's custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. The room went dead silent. "I am so sorry, sir," Clara stammered, her face burning a deep crimson as she frantically reached for a linen napkin. "Let me... Get your hands off me, you clumsy cow," Declan hissed, snatching his arm away. He looked her up and down, his eyes filled with unfiltered disgust. "Christ, they're letting whales serve the drinks now. Have you been eating the hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen, sweetheart?" The Irish crew erupted into cruel, barking laughter. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, the familiar sting of humiliation prickling behind her eyes. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Lorenzo Costa didn't laugh. He slowly twirled a heavy silver poker chip between his long fingers, his dark, calculating eyes shifting from Declan's stained cuff to Clara's trembling form. "Calm down, Declan," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that commanded instant obedience. "It's just a drop of liquor. Don't take it out on the help." Declan scoffed, leaning back in his chair and wiping his cuff. The alcohol had emboldened him, making him reckless. "You always were soft, Costa, playing the gentleman. Tell you what, since you're so charitable." Declan smirked, a nasty, drunken glint in his eye. I'll bet you a cool $5 million you wouldn't take a fat pig like that out in public. Hell, I'll bet you $5 million you wouldn't marry her. The room grew so quiet, you could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Even Declan's men looked nervously between their boss and the Italian Don. It was a gross, blatant display of disrespect, not just to the girl, but to Lorenzo. It was a challenge. Clara stood, paralyzed, clutching the empty silver tray to her chest like a shield. She couldn't breathe. $5 million. To them, she wasn't a human being. She was a punchline, a prop in a pissing contest between two monsters. Lorenzo's expression didn't change. He didn't look at Clara with pity or disgust or anything at all. He looked at Declan, analyzing the power dynamic. If Lorenzo backed down, he looked weak. If he laughed it off, Declan won the psychological upper hand. In their world, reputation was currency, and Lorenzo never lost a bet. Lorenzo finally stopped twirling the chip. He slammed it flat onto the green felt table. The sharp clack echoed like a gunshot. "You're on," Lorenzo said coldly. $5 million. Wire it to the offshore holding account. I'll have the marriage certificate to you by Friday. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She dropped the tray. It clattered violently against the hardwood floor. Without a word, she turned and fled the room, the sound of Declan's roaring laughter chasing her all the way down the service elevator. The next morning, Clara was fired. The catering manager didn't give a reason, just handed her a week's severance in an envelope and told her to clean out her locker. Clara sat on the edge of her cramped apartment bed in Logan Square, staring at a stack of final notice medical bills. She was completely, utterly ruined. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her despair. When she opened it, she didn't find her landlord. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a man built like a brick wall, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. It was Matteo Rossi, Lorenzo Costa's right-hand man and enforcer. "Clara Higgins?" Matteo asked, his tone polite but leaving absolutely no room for refusal. "Mr. Costa would like a word. Please come with me." 30 minutes later, Clara was sitting in a sprawling, glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of Costa Enterprises in the Loop. The city of Chicago spread out below them like a glittering rug. Lorenzo Costa sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing a file. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he commanded. Clara sat on the edge of a leather chair, her hands wringing her cheap cotton purse. Lorenzo closed the file and finally looked at her. In the harsh daylight, he was even more intimidating. His jaw was covered in dark stubble, and his eyes were a piercing, unreadable brown. "I'll keep this brief, Miss Higgins," Lorenzo began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I am a businessman, and I currently find myself in need of a wife for public relations purposes. A temporary arrangement." 1 year. Clara stared at him, bewildered. You want to marry me? Because of what happened last night?" Lorenzo's expression hardened. "What happened last night is irrelevant. What matters is what I am offering you right now." He slid a thick, bound legal document across the desk. "This is a non-disclosure agreement and a marriage contract. You will be my legal wife for exactly 365 days. You will move into my estate in Lake Forest. You will attend public functions when required. You will not ask questions about my business, and you will not interfere in my personal life." "Why me?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "You could have anyone." "Because you are convenient," Lorenzo lied smoothly, never breaking eye contact. "And because I know what you need." He slid a second piece of paper across the desk. It was a bank statement. "I am aware of your sister Sophie's medical condition. I know she needs a bone marrow transplant, and I know your insurance has denied the coverage. Sign this contract, and her medical bills vanish today." The best specialists at Johns Hopkins will fly out tomorrow. When the year is up, you walk away with $2 million, tax-free. Clara stopped breathing. $2 million. Sophie's life saved, all her crushing, suffocating debt wiped out with a single stroke of a pen. She looked at the man across from her. He was a criminal. He was dangerous. And he looked at her as if she were a moderately priced used car he was begrudgingly purchasing. But when she closed her eyes, all she saw was her little sister's pale, sickly face in the hospital bed. Clara picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen resting on the contract. Her hand trembled as she signed her name on the dotted line. "Good," Lorenzo said, taking the paperwork back without a hint of emotion. "Matteo will take you to pack your things. The ceremony is at 2:00. The wedding was a sterile, hollow affair. It took place in a private room at City Hall. There were no flowers, no music, no white dress. Clara wore her best sensible navy suit, which felt painfully tight across her chest and hips. Lorenzo wore a black suit that cost more than Clara had made in the last 3 years. Matteo stood as the witness. The judge, clearly heavily compensated for his discretion, rushed through the vows. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Lorenzo didn't kiss her. He didn't even touch her hand. He simply checked his Rolex, thanked the judge, and walked out the door, leaving Clara scrambling to follow him. Within hours, the news leaked. The media dubbed it a modern-day Cinderella story, the billionaire bachelor and the ordinary working-class girl. But behind closed doors, it was a nightmare. The moment they arrived at the sprawling, Gothic-style Costa estate in Lake Forest, Lorenzo turned to her in the grand foyer. "Your wing is on the east side of the house. My quarters are on the west," Lorenzo instructed coldly, handing her off to the head housekeeper, a severe woman named Mrs. Gable. "Do not disturb me when I am in my study. Dinner is at 8 if I am home. If I am not, do not wait up." Without another word, he walked away, disappearing into the dark, cavernous halls of the mansion. Clara stood in the center of the marble floor, her cheap suitcase sitting pathetically beside her, realizing she had just sold her soul to a man who didn't even view her as a human being. The first 3 months of Clara's marriage were a study in exquisite isolation. The Costa estate was a fortress of limestone and manicured hedges, but to Clara, it was a gilded cage. True to his word, Lorenzo had immediately paid off Sophie's medical debts. The relief of knowing her sister was receiving world-class care was the only thing that kept Clara from breaking under the crushing weight of her new reality. She rarely saw her husband. Lorenzo left before sunrise and returned long after dark. When they did share a meal in the massive, echoing dining room, the silence was suffocating. Lorenzo treated her with a polite, icy indifference that was somehow worse than outright cruelty. He never asked about her day. He never looked at her for longer than a passing glance. The staff took their cues from the master of the house. While never explicitly disobedient, the maids and cooks treated Clara with thinly veiled condescension. They whispered in Italian when she walked past. They served her last. They accidentally shrank her clothes in the wash. Clara, terrified of angering Lorenzo and jeopardizing the contract, swallowed the daily indignities in silence. She spent her days wandering the vast gardens, reading in the library, and stress-eating pastries from the kitchen to fill the gaping hole of loneliness in her chest. She gained 15 pounds in 3 months, her self-esteem plummeting to absolute zero. Then came the night of the winter solstice gala. It was an obligatory public appearance, a massive charity event at the Drake Hotel, where Chicago's elite mingled with its most powerful mobsters behind a veneer of philanthropy. Clara was forced to attend. A stylist had wrestled her into a heavy, dark green velvet gown that felt more like upholstery than clothing. At the gala, Lorenzo played the part of the devoted husband flawlessly for the cameras, placing a possessive hand on the small of her back. But the moment the flashes stopped, he dropped his hand as if she had burned him and vanished into the crowd of suits. Clara, feeling horribly out of place and suffocating under the judgmental stares of the rail-thin socialites, retreated to a secluded, dimly lit balcony overlooking the ballroom. She just wanted to catch her breath. A few minutes later, she heard the heavy thud of footsteps approaching the adjacent, partitioned section of the balcony. The sharp scent of a Cuban cigar drifted over the marble divider. "I gotta hand it to you, Costa," came a familiar, mocking Irish brogue. Declan Gallagher. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. 3 months, and you haven't suffocated the cow yet." Clara's blood ran cold. She froze, pressing her back against the cold stone pillar, terrified to even breathe. "Watch your mouth, Declan," Lorenzo's smooth, dangerous voice replied. "You owe me $5 million. I expect the wire transfer by Monday." "Oh, you'll get your money," Declan laughed. "But tell me, Lorenzo, honestly, how do you stomach it? Having that massive, frumpy eyesore waddling around your beautiful estate. It's a tragedy, a tragic comedy. The great Lorenzo Costa, tied to a whale just to prove a point to me." Clara clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle the sob tearing at her throat. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. "She serves her purpose," Lorenzo said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "The media loves the man of the people narrative. It's easing the heat from the feds. And as for her appearance, she stays out of my way. She is a non-entity, Declan, a prop. The contract is for a year. Once the clock runs out, I'll toss her a payout. She'll go back to whatever slum she crawled out of, and I'll be $5 million richer." The clinking of glasses, a shared, cold laugh. "A $5 million joke," Declan chuckled. "Brilliant, mate. Truly." The men moved back inside, leaving the balcony empty. Clara slowly slid down the stone pillar until she hit the cold floor. Her velvet dress pooled around her. The tears spilled over, ruining her makeup. A bet. It wasn't about PR. It wasn't about convenience. Her marriage, the last 3 months of emotional torture, the whispers, the coldness. It was all a joke. A $5 million dick measuring contest between 2 arrogant, violent men. She cried until her chest ached. She cried for the girl she was, for the dignity she had lost, for the absolute, pathetic reality of her life. But then, somewhere deep in the cavernous hollow of her chest, the crying stopped. The profound, agonizing pain slowly metastasized into something else, something hot, something hard, something sharp. Anger. Pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. Lorenzo Costa thought she was a non-entity. He thought she was a prop. He thought she would take her money in 9 months, bow her head, and waddle back to the slums a broken, humiliated woman. Clara stood up. She wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks with the back of her hand. She looked down at her heavy, trembling hands, and then out at the glittering skyline of Chicago. "No," she thought, her jaw tightening. "I won't be your punchline." The next morning, Clara didn't go to the kitchen for pastries. She didn't hide in the library. Instead, she picked up her phone and made a call to a private, highly discreet number she had found in the society pages. "My name is Clara Costa," she said into the receiver, her voice steady and laced with a newfound steel. "I need your elite physical transformation program. I need a nutritionist, a private trainer, and a stylist. I want them here at the Lake Forest Estate, in the East Wing, starting tomorrow at 5 a.m., and absolutely no one is to know." The Golden Cage was about to become a training ground. The east wing of the Costa estate was vast, impeccably decorated, and entirely forgotten by the master of the house. For Clara, this isolation became her greatest tactical advantage. The morning after the Winter Solstice Gala, the Golden Cage transformed into a crucible. Clara's secret team arrived through the heavily guarded service entrance at 4:30 a.m. sharp, their discretion guaranteed by exorbitant NDAs and hazard pay. At the helm was Caelan Pierce, an ex-British SAS operative turned elite private trainer who catered exclusively to Chicago's paranoid upper crust. He wasn't there to hold her hand. He was there to break her down and rebuild her from the marrow up. Overseeing her internal overhaul was Dr. Aris Sterling, a ruthless endocrinologist and nutritionist who stripped Clara's diet of every comfort she had ever known, replacing the stress-induced pastries with lean proteins, bitter greens, and a brutal fasting regimen. The first month was unadulterated hell. Clara vomited in the manicured bushes of the estate gardens after grueling sprint intervals. Her muscles screamed, her joints ached, and her mind begged her to quit. There were nights she lay on the cold marble floor of her private bathroom, weeping from the sheer physical agony, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the $5 million joke was destined to be her only legacy. But every time the urge to surrender crept in, Clara closed her eyes and heard Declan Gallagher's drunken, barking laugh. She heard Lorenzo's smooth, emotionless voice dismissing her as a non-entity. A prop. The tears dried up, the fat began to melt, and the rage hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp focus. By month 4, the physical changes were undeniable. The heavy, protective layers Clara had worn her entire adult life were shedding rapidly. Her cheekbones emerged, sharp and aristocratic. Her posture, once slumped in a perpetual state of apology, straightened into a terrifyingly confident spine. To hide her metamorphosis from the estate staff and her phantom husband, Clara adopted a uniform of oversized, shapeless cashmere sweaters and baggy silk trousers. Lorenzo barely noticed. He was engulfed in an escalating turf war with the Canaryville Irish faction, spending his nights out on the docks or locked in his West Wing study, bleeding capital to keep the local politicians and the FBI's organized crime task force off his back. The few times they crossed paths in the echoing hallways, he looked right through her, his eyes glassy with stress and calculating coldness. He saw only what he expected to see. The pathetic, quiet girl he had bought to win a bet, but Clara was no longer quiet. She was listening. Genevieve Dupont, a Parisian expat and social strategist, was the final member of Clara's clandestine team. While Caelan built her body, Genevieve weaponized her presence. She taught Clara the subtle arts of psychological dominance, how to hold eye contact until the other person broke, how to modulate her voice to command a room without raising it, and the lethal grace of high society etiquette. More importantly, Clara began an education of her own. She realized that physical beauty was fleeting, but financial leverage was absolute. Using the quiet hours of the night, Clara began to slip into Lorenzo's study. He was arrogant enough to believe his home was impenetrable, leaving crucial documents in his unlocked mahogany desk. Clara possessed a photographic memory, a skill she had previously only used to memorize seating charts at Bella's banquets. Now, she used it to memorize the labyrinthine structure of Costa Enterprises. She traced the flow of illicit cash from the underground casinos in the South Loop, through a web of shell companies registered in Delaware, straight into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She discovered the names of the aldermen on Lorenzo's payroll. She memorized the shipping manifests of the illicit cargo arriving at Port of Chicago. One rainy Tuesday in month 7, Clara found a ledger detailing the exact financial vulnerabilities of Declan Gallagher's Irish syndicate, weaknesses Lorenzo was preparing to exploit. She also found the holding account where the $5 million bet was sitting in escrow. Clara sat in the leather chair of her husband's study, the glow of a small penlight illuminating the incriminating numbers. A dark, wicked smile touched her lips, a smile Lorenzo had never seen. She wasn't just going to survive the end of this contract. She was going to own them both. October descended on Chicago with a biting, icy wind. It was month 11 of the contract. 30 days left until Clara was supposed to be quietly discarded with a $2 million payout and a gag order. The event of the decade was upon them. The La Cosa Nostra Centenary Gala, held at the Field Museum. It was a massive, ostentatious display of wealth and power, a neutral ground summit where the city's rival syndicates, corrupt politicians, and high society elite gathered under the guise of funding the arts. Attendance was mandatory for the heads of the families. Lorenzo had not spoken a direct sentence to Clara in 6 weeks. That morning, Mrs. Gable, the severe head housekeeper, dropped a garment bag on Clara's bed with a sneer. "Mr. Costa expects you ready by 8. He selected the dress himself," Mrs. Gable said, turning on her heel. Clara unzipped the bag. It was a high-necked, shapeless taffeta gown in a dull, muted grey. It was designed to make the wearer invisible. It was an insult cast in fabric. Clara walked over to the marble fireplace, struck a long match, and dropped it onto the grey taffeta. She watched it burn until nothing was left but ash. At 8:15 p.m., Matteo Rossi stood nervously in the grand foyer, checking his watch. Lorenzo was already waiting in the armored Bentley outside, and the boss despised lateness. "Mrs. Costa!" Matteo barked up the grand staircase. "We need to leave." "I am ready, Matteo." The voice didn't sound like Clara. It was smooth, dark, and dripped with an icy authority that made Matteo's spine snap straight. He looked up. The breath physically left Matteo's lungs. He took a staggered step backward. Descending the sweeping marble staircase was a ghost, a goddess, a weapon forged in hellfire. Clara had lost 70 pounds, but she hadn't just become thin, she had become statuesque. She wore a custom, blood-red Alexander McQueen gown that clung to her curves like a second skin, featuring a plunging neckline and a thigh-high slit that revealed legs toned to lethal perfection by Kaylin Pierce. Her dark hair, once a frizzy, apologetic bun, cascaded down her back in sleek, midnight waves. Her lips were painted a dark crimson, and her eyes, framed by sharp, predatory makeup, held a terrifying, predatory calm. She looked like money. She looked like power. She looked like the ruin of men. "Close your mouth, Matteo," Clara said evenly, pausing at the bottom of the stairs to slip on a pair of elbow-length black silk gloves. "You look foolish." Matteo, a hardened killer who had never flinched in a firefight, stammered, "Mom, Mrs. Costa? Clara. Take me to my husband." Outside, the freezing wind whipped off Lake Michigan. Lorenzo sat in the cavernous back seat of the Bentley, scrolling impatiently through emails on his phone. The passenger door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and the intoxicating scent of Tom Ford's Black Orchid. "You're late," Lorenzo snapped, not looking up from his screen. "And I told you to wear the grey." Lorenzo froze. His eyes flicked upward, the reprimand dying in his throat. The phone slipped from his hand, tumbling onto the plush floorboards. For the first time in his 34 years, Lorenzo Costa, the untouchable Don of Chicago, was entirely speechless. He stared at the woman settling into the leather seat beside him. His brain ruthlessly tried to reconcile the frumpy, terrified caterer he had bought 11 months ago, with the breathtaking aristocratic siren sitting inches away. "Hello, Lorenzo," Clara purred, her voice a silken threat. She didn't shrink away from his gaze. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his with a ferocious, challenging heat. I decided grey wasn't my color. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. A chaotic storm of shock, confusion, and a sudden, violent surge of possessive lust flared in his chest. He reached out, his large hand hovering just inches from her bare shoulder, as if trying to prove she was a hallucination. "Clara," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. What is this?" "This," Clara replied, casually brushing his hand away with a dismissive flick of her wrist, "is what a $5 million investment looks like. Try to keep up." The drive to the Field Museum was suffocatingly silent. Lorenzo couldn't tear his eyes away from her. The dynamic in the car had shattered and reformed. He was no longer the apex predator, and he knew it. When the Bentley pulled up to the red carpet, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi went into a blinding frenzy. Lorenzo stepped out first, offering his hand as a matter of protocol. Clara ignored it. She stepped out of the vehicle with the predatory grace of a panther, the blood-red gown catching the flashing lights like a fresh wound. The crowd went dead quiet. The paparazzi lowered their cameras in sheer awe. As they walked up the grand stone steps and entered the massive, vaulted atrium of the museum, the effect was apocalyptic. The elite of Chicago's underworld stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the cavernous room snapped to the woman in red. Standing by a towering skeleton of a T-Rex was Declan Gallagher, surrounded by his Irish lieutenants. He held a glass of champagne, holding court with an arrogant smirk. Clara locked eyes with Declan from across the room. She didn't look away. She smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that promised absolute destruction. Declan's smirk vanished. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering violently against the marble floor. The shattering of Declan Gallagher's champagne glass echoed like a gunshot in the vaulted atrium of the Field Museum. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The string quartet in the corner had completely faltered, their bows frozen over their instruments. The elite of Chicago's underworld, men who orchestrated violence before their morning espresso, stared in absolute, paralyzed bewilderment at the woman standing at the center of the room. Clara did not flinch. She did not look at her shoes. She held her chin high, the blood-red Alexander McQueen gown flowing around her like spilled wine, her dark eyes fixed on the Irish mobster with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. Declan's face went through a rapid, comical series of emotions. Shock, confusion, and finally, a deep flush of humiliated rage. He stepped away from the dinosaur skeleton, trying to compose his features into his trademark arrogant sneer, but the attempt fell pitifully flat. He looked down at the shattered glass at his feet, then back up to Clara. Well, Declan drawled, his brogue thicker than usual as he tried to mask his unease. "Mrs. Costa, I must confess, I didn't recognize you. You seem to have misplaced a significant portion of yourself since the last time you were serving me drinks." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. It was a vile insult, a desperate attempt to drag her back to the status of a lowly, humiliated caterer. Lorenzo, standing slightly behind Clara, tensed. His jaw locked, and his hand instinctively moved toward the inside breast pocket of his tuxedo. But before Lorenzo could draw his weapon or utter a single threat, Clara moved. She took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward Declan. The crowd parted for her as if she were Moses at the Red Sea. When she was close enough to smell the stale whiskey on his breath, she stopped. Genevieve DuPont had taught her the power of proximity. When you invade a predator's space without fear, you become the predator. "It is a pity, Declan," Clara said, her voice perfectly modulated. It wasn't a shout, but the absolute silence of the room carried her silken, icy tone to every corner. I have shed the weight that was holding me back, but it seems you are still burdened by yours. Tell me, how are the profit margins on the Canaryville docks holding up? Declan's sneer vanished instantly. The color drained from his face. Clara smiled, a razor-thin, predatory curve of her red lips. Because from what I understand, the stevedores' union is threatening a wildcat strike by midnight on Thursday if you don't renegotiate their hazard pay. And it would be a terrible shame if that shipment of unlicensed pharmaceuticals rotting in container 42 was seized by the Port Authority because your men were too busy picketing to unload it. The silence in the room deepened into a suffocating vacuum. Declan's lieutenants instinctively reached for their waistbands, their eyes darting nervously toward Lorenzo. Declan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't know what you're talking about. You crazy—" "And while we are discussing shedding dead weight," Clara interrupted, taking one final half-step forward, dropping her voice to a lethal, velvet whisper, meant only for him and Lorenzo. "I suggest you take a closer look at your second-in-command, O'Shea. He has been skimming 10% off your underground sports books for the last 6 months and routing it through a shell company in the Caymans, account ending in 8842. You're bleeding out, Declan, and you don't even have the sense to feel the knife." Declan looked like he had been physically struck. His eyes widened in sheer panic. The specific details, the container number, the Union strike, the offshore account, were his most closely guarded, catastrophic secrets. Clara held his panicked gaze for 3 long seconds, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. Then, with a dismissive, elegant turn, she pivoted back to her husband. Lorenzo was staring at her as if she were a ghost, an alien, a deity of war that had just descended from the sky. The cold, calculating mob boss was entirely unspooled. "Lorenzo," Clara said softly, offering him her arm with the grace of a duchess. "I am suddenly finding the company here incredibly tedious. Take me to the VIP lounge." Lorenzo didn't speak. He couldn't. He mechanically offered his arm, and Clara looped her black silk-gloved hand through it. Together they walked away from a hyperventilating Declan Gallagher, leaving the entire Chicago syndicate in a state of absolute, bewildered chaos. The rest of the gala was a blur. Clara played the room flawlessly. She charmed the corrupt alderman with fluent, articulate discussions on city zoning laws. She terrified the rival mob wives with her icy, impenetrable demeanor. Lorenzo remained glued to her side, acting as a bodyguard rather than a husband, his mind racing 1,000 miles a minute. Who the hell was this woman? Where did she get that intel? The moment they were back in the armored Bentley, the privacy partition sliding up to seal them off from Matteo, the illusion snapped. "Who are you working for?" Lorenzo snarled, his voice a violent, dangerous hiss. He closed the distance between them, grabbing her by the bare shoulders and pinning her back against the plush leather seat. His eyes were wild, dark, and filled with a lethal paranoia. "Are you a Fed? A plant? How do you know about O'Shea? How do you know about Container 42? Clara didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She looked down at his large, rough hands gripping her skin, and then slowly brought her eyes up to meet his. "Take your hands off me, Lorenzo." It was the tone of a woman who was entirely unafraid to die. Lorenzo hesitated. The absolute lack of fear in her eyes was more disarming than a loaded gun. Slowly, his grip loosened, and he pulled back, though his chest still heaved with adrenaline. "Answer me," he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. Clara calmly smoothed the fabric of her dress. "I am not a Fed. I am not a plant. I am the woman you bought to be a piece of furniture. You just made the critical error of assuming that furniture couldn't read." Lorenzo frowned, his brow furrowing. "Read what? Your ledgers? Your files? The encrypted hard drive you keep in the bottom left drawer of your mahogany desk? The password for which is your late mother's maiden name, followed by the year she immigrated," Clara recited effortlessly. "I have a photographic memory, Lorenzo. It used to help me remember 50 different appetizer orders at Bella's banquets. Now it helps me remember the exact routing numbers of your offshore holding companies." Lorenzo felt a cold spike of genuine terror pierce his heart. His empire, his life's work, his secrets. She had seen all of it. "You broke into my study," he breathed, the realization dawning on him. "You left the door unlocked," Clara corrected sharply, "because you were so arrogant, so utterly convinced of my insignificance, that you didn't even bother to secure your own fortress against the woman sleeping down the hall." She leaned forward, closing the space between them until he could smell the intoxicating scent of her perfume. "I know everything, Lorenzo," she whispered, her eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 humiliations. "I know about the bribes to Alderman Davis. I know about the vulnerabilities in your South Loop casinos. And most importantly, I know about the $5 million bet sitting in escrow at the Bank of Geneva." Lorenzo stopped breathing. Clara smiled, a cold, empty expression. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I would just take my $2 million and vanish quietly, letting you two arrogant bastards laugh about the clumsy cow over scotch for the rest of your lives?" "Clara," Lorenzo started, his voice completely hollowed out. "Don't," she snapped, cutting him off with the precision of a scalpel. She leaned back, staring out the tinted window at the passing city lights. "The contract ends in 30 days, but the rules of our arrangement have just changed. From this moment on, you will treat me with the absolute respect that I demand. You will not hide me. You will not dismiss me. Because if you do, Lorenzo, I promise you, I will burn your empire to the ground and dance in the ashes." The morning after the centenary gala, the atmosphere inside the Costa estate had fundamentally altered. The air was thick, suffocating, vibrating with an unseen, electric tension. Lorenzo hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night tearing his West Wing study apart, changing passwords, locking safes, and frantically calling his accountants to verify his holdings. Everything was untouched. Not a single cent was missing. The files were exactly where he left them. It drove him to the brink of madness. Clara hadn't stolen anything. She had simply memorized his ruin. When he finally emerged from his study at 9 a.m., his eyes bloodshot and his tie undone, he found the mansion in a state of quiet upheaval. Mrs. Gable, the severe housekeeper who had spent the last 11 months treating Clara like a pestilence, was standing in the grand foyer, physically shaking. She was holding a stack of freshly pressed linens. "What is going on?" Lorenzo barked. It's Mrs. Costa, sir," Mrs. Gable stammered, her face pale. "She ordered us to pack her belongings from the East Wing." Lorenzo felt a sudden, sharp panic seize his chest. Was she leaving? Was she going to the feds? "Where is she?" She instructed us to move her things into the master suite, sir, with you. She said the East Wing was too drafty." Lorenzo stared at the housekeeper, utterly speechless. Clara was invading his sanctuary. She was planting her flag in the very center of his life. Before he could process this blatant power move, his phone vibrated violently in his pocket. It was a restricted number. "Costa," he answered, his tone lethal. "Lorenzo, it's Arthur." The panicked voice of his chief financial architect, Arthur Penhaligon, crackled through the speaker. "We have a catastrophic problem. "Speak," Lorenzo ordered, rubbing his temples, feeling a massive migraine building behind his eyes. "The Geneva holding account. The one holding the 5 million for the Gallagher wager. It's gone." Lorenzo froze. The marble floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? Wire transfers of that size require a dual authentication token. I have the physical key fob on me. I know." Arthur sounded like he was hyperventilating. "But the bank received an encrypted authorization packet at 6 a.m. It used your digital signature, bypassed the token requirement using a backdoor protocol we set up for emergencies, and transferred the entire 5 million. "To where?" Lorenzo roared, his composure snapping. "That's the worst part, sir. It wasn't moved to an offshore shell. It was donated, in its entirety, to the Mercy Hospital Pediatric Oncology Wing. The transfer is public. The press already has it. They're hailing you as the greatest philanthropist in Chicago." Lorenzo lowered the phone slowly. Mercy Hospital, the Pediatric Oncology Wing, where Clara's sister, Sophie, was being treated. Clara hadn't just stolen the money. She had weaponized it. She had used his illegal, blood-soaked gambling money to fund a children's hospital, making it entirely impossible for him to reclaim it without looking like a monster to the public and the authorities. She had outplayed him on a level he didn't even know existed. He hung up on the hysterical accountant and marched toward the sweeping marble staircase. He took the steps 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs, a chaotic blend of furious rage and an undeniable, sickening awe coursing through his veins. He threw open the heavy oak double doors to the West Wing master suite. Clara was sitting in his vintage leather armchair by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. She was wearing a perfectly tailored emerald green silk robe, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She held a crystal tumbler filled with 2 fingers of his private reserve, Macallan 25, the exact scotch that had spilled on Declan's suit 11 months ago. She looked up as he burst into the room, her expression serene, totally unbothered by the fact that he looked ready to murder someone. "Good morning, Lorenzo," Clara said smoothly, taking a slow sip of the amber liquid. "I hope you don't mind. I prefer the view from this side of the house." Lorenzo slammed the heavy oak doors shut behind him, locking them with a sharp click. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, stopping just inches from her chair. He loomed over her, a dark, terrifying monolith of violence. "You stole $5 million from me," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that vibrated in his chest. "I liberated it," Clara corrected calmly, resting the glass on her knee. "It was blood money, Lorenzo, wagered on my humiliation. I simply repurposed it for something decent. The PR team is going to love it. You're a hero." "I will kill you," Lorenzo whispered, his hands gripping the armrests of her chair, trapping her. He leaned his face down until his nose almost brushed hers. "I will snap your neck, bury you under the foundation of a high-rise, and tell the world you ran away." Clara didn't blink. She reached up, her cool, manicured fingers gently tracing the sharp line of his jaw. The touch sent an involuntary shockwave through Lorenzo's system. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched him. "No, you won't," Clara said softly, her dark eyes locking onto his with absolute, chilling certainty. "Because at 6:05 a.m., 5 minutes after the money was transferred, I sent an encrypted dead man's switch to 3 different investigative journalists at the Tribune and 1 contact at the FBI field office." Lorenzo's breath hitched. "If I am harmed, if I disappear, or if I fail to enter a secure passcode every 24 hours, Clara continued, her voice like velvet wrapped around a steel blade, A file containing the entire structural blueprint of Costa Enterprises, the shell companies, the bribes, the port schedules, the exact locations of your safe houses, will automatically decrypt and publish. Lorenzo stared at her, entirely paralyzed. The beautiful, terrifying woman sitting in his chair wasn't just his wife. She was his executioner. "You bought me to be a pawn, Lorenzo," Clara whispered, her lips ghosting over his jawline. "But you underestimated the board. The game isn't over. It's just that now I am the one moving the pieces. And you are going to help me destroy Declan Gallagher." The silence in the master suite was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crashing of the icy Lake Michigan waves against the seawall outside. Lorenzo Costa stared at the woman sitting in his leather chair, the woman he had bought for $5 million. He had expected tears, begging, or perhaps a quiet, terrified retreat. Instead, he was looking down the barrel of a brilliantly orchestrated hostile takeover of his own life. Slowly, the murderous tension in Lorenzo's shoulders began to dissolve, replaced by a dark, twisting sense of awe. He was a man who respected power above all else, and Clara was currently radiating it like a nuclear reactor. He took a step back, running a hand through his dark hair, a hollow, breathless laugh escaping his lips. "You're out of your mind. Do you have any idea what you've just done, Clara? Declan Gallagher is not going to just roll over and accept that he was publicly humiliated by a woman he considers a peasant. He is going to declare war on this family. He will come for my head, and he will come for yours." "Let him come," Clara said, taking another calm sip of the Macallan 25. "Declan operates on brute force and whiskey-fueled ego. I operate on data." By 9 a.m., the Stevedores Union in Canaryville officially walked off the job, just as I predicted. His shipping containers are sitting unguarded at the port of Chicago. His underground sports books are bleeding cash because his second-in-command, O'Shea, is quietly draining the accounts. She stood up, the emerald silk of her robe brushing against the hardwood floor. "He is a wounded animal, Lorenzo. This isn't a war, it's a culling, and I have just handed you the knife." Lorenzo looked at her, truly looking at her, seeing past the incredible physical transformation to the lethal, calculating machine she had built inside her mind. The shift in their dynamic was instantaneous and violently magnetic. "What do you want, Clara?" Lorenzo asked, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register. "You have the dead man's switch. You have the leverage. You could destroy me today. Why are you offering to help me?" Clara stepped closer, her dark eyes locking onto his. The scent of her perfume mixed with the sharp aroma of his scotch. "Because destroying you doesn't give me what I want," she murmured softly. "I didn't suffer through the last 11 months of isolation and humiliation just to walk away with a payout and a quiet life. I want Declan Gallagher to lose everything. I want the men who laughed at me in that poker room to beg for their lives. I want the empire, Lorenzo, and I want to run it with you as an equal." Before Lorenzo could respond, his phone buzzed again. It was Matteo. "Boss!" Matteo's voice was tense, the sound of screeching tires in the background. "We have a massive problem. Alderman Richard Davis just called. The press is swarming him about your $5 million hospital donation. But that's not the worst part. Gallagher's crew just hit 2 of our South Loop casinos. They shot out the windows and firebombed the entrances. It's open warfare." Lorenzo's eyes flashed with predatory excitement. He looked at Clara, who hadn't flinched at the news. "Get the men ready," Lorenzo barked into the phone. "Lock down the estate. We go to ground." He hung up and turned to his wife. "Get dressed, partner. We're going to the safe house. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in organized chaos. Lorenzo and Clara operated out of a fortified subterranean bunker beneath a defunct meatpacking plant in the West Loop. For the first time in his life, Lorenzo deferred to someone else. Clara set up a command center with 3 encrypted laptops, systematically dismantling Declan's financial infrastructure, while Lorenzo's soldiers, led by Matteo, engaged in bloody, tactical skirmishes on the streets. Clara waged a silent, devastating war on the digital front. She froze Declan's offshore accounts using the routing numbers she had memorized. She anonymously tipped off the DEA about the exact location of Declan's unlicensed pharmaceutical shipments. Within 2 days, the Irish syndicate was crippled. They couldn't pay their men, they couldn't move their product, and the police were closing in. On the 3rd night, the tension in the bunker reached a boiling point. Lorenzo was pacing the concrete floor, a map of the city spread out on the table, marking Declan's shrinking territories. He looked exhausted, his dress shirt unbuttoned, his sleeves rolled up to reveal dark tattoos wrapping his forearms. Clara was sitting at a terminal, rubbing her tired eyes. She wore black tactical trousers and a tight black turtleneck, her hair pulled back into a severe ponytail. "I've got him," Clara whispered suddenly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Lorenzo stopped pacing and rushed to her side, leaning over her chair. The heat radiating from his chest pressed against her back. "What is it?" "I found the digital trail for O'Shea's embezzled funds," Clara said, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "I just forwarded the entire dossier to Declan's private email. In about 5 minutes, Declan is going to realize his own lieutenant has been robbing him blind." Lorenzo let out a low whistle, staring at the screen, and then slowly shifted his gaze to the side of Clara's face. "You are entirely ruthless," he murmured. "I learned from the best," she replied, turning her head slightly. They were inches apart. The adrenaline of the last 3 days, the intoxicating rush of absolute power, and the undeniable, scorching physical attraction finally snapped the fragile tether holding them back. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He reached down, his large hand tangling in her dark hair, and pulled her to her feet, crashing his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was violent, possessive, and fueled by a year of suppressed tension. Clara responded with equal ferocity, her hands gripping the lapels of his shirt, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. In the dim, flickering light of the subterranean bunker, the $5 million joke officially died, replaced by a dark, unbreakable alliance forged in fire, blood, and mutual destruction. It was day 360 of the marriage contract. 5 days left until Clara was legally allowed to vanish. But vanishing was no longer on the agenda. Declan Gallagher was a ruined man. His lieutenants had either abandoned him, been arrested, or, in the case of O'Shea, been dealt with in a bloody alleyway after Declan received Clara's dossier. The Irish faction was entirely bankrupt, their territories absorbed by the Italian syndicate with terrifying efficiency. Desperate, cornered, and entirely out of options, Declan reached out for a parley. He requested a sit-down to surrender his remaining assets in exchange for safe passage out of Chicago. The meeting was set for midnight at an abandoned steel mill on the city's far south side. Rain poured in sheets through the rusted holes in the corrugated iron roof, the water hitting the concrete floor like a ticking clock. Declan arrived with only 2 remaining guards. He looked 15 years older than he had at the centenary gala. His custom Tom Ford suit hung loosely on his frame, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a leather briefcase containing the deeds to his remaining legitimate businesses. He walked into the center of the massive, echoing warehouse, expecting to see Lorenzo Costa flanked by an army of enforcers. Instead, a single spotlight illuminated a solitary figure sitting at a rusted iron desk. It was Clara. She wore a tailored, immaculately cut black Saint Laurent suit, her dark hair sleek and straight, falling like a curtain over her shoulders. She sat back in the chair, her legs crossed, a suppressed Sig Sauer, 9mm, resting casually on the desk next to a crystal glass of water. Matteo stood silently in the shadows behind her, a ghost in the darkness. Lorenzo was nowhere to be seen. Declan stopped dead in his tracks, his face twisting in a mixture of confusion and absolute rage. "Where is Costa? I asked for a parley with the Don, not his glorified secretary." Clara smiled, the same cold, terrifying smile she had given him at the museum. "Lorenzo is busy securing the Canaryville docks, you know, the ones you used to own. You are dealing with me, Declan. I am not handing my empire over to a—" Declan sneered, trying to summon the arrogance that had defined his life, but his voice cracked. "To a what, Declan?" Clara asked, her voice echoing through the steel mill. "A clumsy cow, a fat pig, a whale." She stood up, slowly picking up the suppressed pistol. She walked around the desk, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. "You made a bet, Declan. You bet $5 million that I was nothing, that I could be bought, humiliated, and discarded." She stopped 10 feet away from him. "I am the woman who drained your bank accounts. I am the woman who broke your union. I am the woman who turned your right-hand man against you and left you bleeding in the street," Clara said, raising the gun and pointing it directly at Declan's chest. "You are going to place that briefcase on the desk. You are going to sign the transfer deeds, and then you are going to take the private jet waiting at O'Hare and fly to Dublin. If you ever set foot in Chicago again, or if you ever speak my name, I won't freeze your bank accounts. I will put a bullet between your eyes myself." Declan looked at the gun, then at the terrifying, stone-cold conviction in Clara's eyes. He realized with a crushing finality that he had been entirely outplayed by the woman he had treated like dirt. His shoulders slumped, the fight completely drained out of him. With trembling hands, Declan walked forward, placed the leather briefcase on the rusted desk, and opened it. He signed the documents, his signature erratic and frantic. Without looking back, he turned and walked out into the pouring rain, a ghost of his former self. Clara watched him go, lowering the weapon. From the shadows on the upper catwalk, slow, deliberate clapping echoed through the warehouse. Lorenzo descended the iron metal stairs, his dark eyes fixed on Clara with a look of absolute worship. He walked over to the desk, glancing at the signed documents that officially made him the undisputed king of Chicago. But he didn't care about the paper. He cared about the queen who had secured it. 5 days later, day 365, Clara stood in the grand office of Costa Enterprises, looking out at the glittering skyline. The city was theirs. The media was still running stories about the philanthropist mob boss and his brilliant, stunning wife who spearheaded the Costa Charitable Foundation. The feds had backed off, lacking any financial evidence to build a RICO case. The heavy mahogany doors opened, and Lorenzo walked in. He carried 2 items, a bottle of Macallan 25 and a thick, bound legal document, the marriage contract. He walked over to his desk, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and handed one to Clara. "Today is the day," Lorenzo said, his voice low, his eyes searching hers. "The contract is fulfilled. The $2 million has already been transferred to your private account. You are a free woman, Clara. You can walk out that door, never see me again, and live the rest of your life as a very wealthy, very dangerous woman." Clara looked at the document on the desk. Then she looked at the man standing before her, the monster who had bought her, the partner who had fought beside her, the man who had ultimately recognized her true worth when the rest of the world only saw a punchline. Lorenzo picked up the contract. He didn't ask her a question. He didn't beg. He simply pulled a silver Zippo lighter from his pocket, sparked the flame, and touched it to the corner of the paper. They watched together in silence as the contract burned to ash, dropping the remnants into a heavy glass ashtray on the desk. "I don't want a contract," Lorenzo murmured, stepping into her space, his hands wrapping possessively around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "I want my wife. I want my Don. I want you, Clara. Forever." Clara smiled, sliding her arms around his neck, the power radiating from her very core. She was no longer the frightened girl from the South Side. She was Clara Costa, and she owned the monster, the money, and the city. "I'm not going anywhere, Lorenzo," she whispered against his lips. "We have an empire to run. What started as a cruel $5 million joke in a smoke-filled room ended with the absolute destruction of a Mafia empire and the birth of a brand-new Queen of Chicago. Clara didn't just survive the humiliation. She weaponized it, completely outsmarting the most dangerous men in the city and taking the throne for herself. This is the ultimate proof that you should never underestimate the quiet ones in the room. If this epic tale of revenge, dark romance, and a jaw-dropping glow-up kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this incredible story with anyone who loves a powerful, mastermind female lead who flips the script on her enemies. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our thrilling, true-life, and dark romance storytelling videos. Let us know in the comments. What was the most satisfying moment of Clara's revenge for you? See you in the next video.